Good evening, everyone. Time for episode 30 of Kur's Rage, part 1 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga by me, starting at page 311. The party is in deadly combat with red orcs and trying to survive in the northern reaches. And we're worried about Carmen as the battle continues from the last episode. Okay. The orcs were nearly upon Kalor when Karina surprised them. All three of them fell back, fearing some greater foe, for it seemed that the very trees had spawned her, and she wielded a great sword. She attacked without hesitation, and their sudden indecision left one of them with a limp and a useless shield arm. She may indeed have been able to defeat these orcs alone, for it seemed to Kalor that she was magnificent with her weapon. But he didn't want to leave her life to chance, nor to her own self-confidence, so he invoked the scroll's power, conjuring his phantasm. The spell's power was only limited by his imagination. Only the depth of his understanding determined its effectiveness. This time, he didn't need his imagination to conjure what he wished, for he summoned images of what he could plainly see, perfect duplicates of Karina Greylinks fighting with her sword. If she hadn't been so intent on her attack, Kalor's illusion might have unnerved her to the point of some fatal mistake. But she was a warrior born, and she could adapt to the constant changes of battle. Kalor's spell actually enhanced her abilities. Now each orc faced one Karina, but only she knew which one was real. She sliced and hewed, in the Lyosulfar blur of liquid fury. The orcs lashed out, fencing with elf maidens of smoke, of snow, of air. They were in complete chaos. Karina was in complete control. Within moments she stood alone, looking upon three fallen orcs, with three pairs of elfin eyes. Kalor intended to maintain his illusion for as long as possible, but the rightmost war master had seen him and recognized him as a wizard. If it hadn't been for the presence of the Orcan deathbolt in his shoulder, he could have continued to help Karina, but the pain was excruciating. The orcs must have placed some form of vile poison upon the arrowhead that burned like fire. Falling down into his foxhole, he tried to summon the strength to pull it out. Crunch was following the course of the battle intently. He believed that no more of his enemies were still hidden, and that allowed him to free all his remaining strength. More than half of his force had fallen, but all his war masters yet lived, and he still had 4 Goru. Many of his enemies were wounded, and his advantage remained. Crag had taken the gnome out of the fight, and at least one of the elves were injured. Without the gnome's magic, the fight was a purely physical one, and that was his kind of battle. Driving forward upon his ox, he issued his commands. "Grond, stomp, smash," he shouted. "The elves. Thorn, Crag, the elf bitch. I will take the dwarf." Plowing into the tree fall, he urged his Goru to greater effort. "Push, Mogo, push." He hoped that the dwarf was indeed Agardok, for if he alone claimed the victory, then he would surely become chief of the Drums of Doom. Then he would have a full herd of females to himself. Behind the barricade, Kur and Carmen fell back, for surely this orc didn't mean to ride over their shielding deadfall. But they had never witnessed the true strength of the orc steeds before, and they had no way of knowing that the trees were little more than twigs before their incredible strength. The orc rode his Goru directly into their barricade, and the mighty animal hooked its horns beneath the 2-foot-thick trees and charged forward in a mad fury of strength. The trees folded before its might, thrusting back violently upon Kur and Carmen. The explosion of trees, branches, and snow happened so suddenly that it was unavoidable. Carmen was swept beneath the rightmost tree trunk. When the Goru had finished clearing the path, she couldn't move, for the tree held her fast beneath its crushing weight. Her sword was lost to her, and her breath was gone. She tried to breathe, but the great weight on her chest stole more of her air each time she exhaled. Panic gripped her heart, She was helpless. She was suffocating. She knew that the end was near. Kur had been more fortunate. Ducking beneath the leftmost tree as it swung toward him, he hewed off the sideward limb that threatened to drag him down. The trunk passed over him harmlessly. When he stood up, the ox had already moved past him. The war master tried to train his death bow on him, but his angle was bad and his shots went wide. Rushing into the Goru, he struck at its belly with raging determination. His blow cut the orc's saddle strap and the beast's belly at the same time. The Goru turned to gore him. His rider was unseated. But Kur's stroke hadn't finished the ox, and although the animal was mortally wounded, it was far from dead. Its pain enraged it. Swinging its horrible horns upon him, he was struck. Up and up he flew, and any other creature that was not one of Moridaeus' children would have been torn in two by the blow. But he was Baldric, a direct descendant. But he was a direct descendant. But he was a direct descendant of Baldric, forged by Moridaeus in ancient times from mithril, iron, and stone, and the god's breath had given him life. Even now, countless generations later, some of that resiliency remained in Kur's people. Never before had he flown so far, nor had he ever been struck so hard. His landing was anything but graceful. All that it did was make him madder still. Somehow, Korun-Koth had remained in his grasp. The pain in his chest and back was intense, driving him toward the red rage of the berserker. Only his tight grip on his axe kept him from going insane with madness. Rising to his feet, he let out a great guttural roar like some beast from the depths of Tempest, and he strode toward the Goru to finish what he'd started. Crunch had fallen, but he wasn't out of the fight. Rising up, he raised his death bow and struck Kur twice in the chest. The dwarf bled. His bolts had found living flesh. This was not Argadok. He was just a dwarf, after all. Pain consumed him. His axe empowered him, the spirits of all its dead wielders calling out to him. He became the avatar of his god. He became Korun-Koth, Kur-Rogoth. Abandoning his shield, he sent his axe spinning. Stepping thrice and hacking twice, his blade bit deeply into sinew and bone. The Goru charged him, but fell as he severed its left foreleg and opened its exposed throat. The beast reared in its throes of death, and Kur was again thrown to the ground. But Korun-Koth was still raging, and he rose as if he felt no pain, nor feared any mortal foe. Crunch rose and came forth with his great war club. Orcsius strode where he strode, pot-bellied and huge. He was the leader of his pack of hunters. He was the master of many battles against dwarf, elf, and man alike. He was certain that this dwarf was nearly dead, for surely 3 killing blows had already struck him. The sound of their weapons clashing resounded throughout the hills. It was the dull sound of an axe blade striking hardened wood, for the orcs tempered their spiked clubs with fire when they made them. The war master was immensely strong, towering over Kur, but Kur's blood rage made his strength super-dwarven, and he was little daunted by his enemy's size. It was avatar against avatar, dwarf and orc, grappling in a duel to the death. Seconds seemed an eternity, but in the end, Korun-Koth prevailed, for though the orc's club was fire-hardened, it couldn't withstand the keen edge of Kur-Rogoth. Slowly, inexorably, the war master's weapon was torn asunder. Crunch saw his chances for victory slipping away from him. In desperation, he swung his half-broken club at Kur with all his might, and again Korun-Koth reached up, and lo, it did cleave Crunch's weapon at the hilt, but the rest of his club could not be stopped, and it slammed into Kur's helm with astounding force. If Kur had felt any of his terrible wounds, then surely he would have fallen. He should have lost consciousness when Crunch's blow struck him, but he was past the pain. All that his mind knew was rage. All his body felt was fury. He was unstoppable. Crunch stared dumbfounded at his nemesis. 2 bolts protruded from his chest, and blood flowed from nearly every part of his body. If this dwarf's armor had once held the silver sheen of steel, it did not do so now. He could do nothing save draw his long dagger and thrust it desperately. Kur's first cut hewed that thrusting hand off, and his second blow was the final one. No more would Crunch take the lives of dwarf, elf, or man. Leander, Dartin, and Dow met the advancing war masters, and Tarek was right behind them. 2 of the orcs before them were afoot, and the 3rd rode ahead of them upon his ox. Leander, Dartin said, let's take the footman. You 2 take down the rider. Evading the ox, they charged ahead to meet them. Dartin rushed in a little too fast, and when he met the lead orc, his momentum drove them both to the ground. Smash was little hurt by the tactic, and he rose quickly to squash him with his club. But Dartin, like Leander, was well trained in the use of his shield. He slammed it against the orc, and with his sword cut swiftly and deeply through a gap in his armor. They struggled, weapon arms grappling and unable to break free. Smash was a master of war, the most cunning and strongest of his kind. He smashed the elf with his gauntleted fist. He hoisted his enemy above him in order to hurl him to the ground. Leander fenced with his foe and couldn't help him. Air exploded from Dartin's lungs. He could barely see through the mass of dancing stars before his eyes, but whether it was some inner awareness, battle instinct, or Odin's mighty hand, none would ever know. For when Smash swung his killing stroke down, Dartin rolled in at the last second and skewered him with his sword. But the descending club could not be stopped, and Dartin was smote. Their bodies and blood mingled upon the snowy slope. Leander fought skillfully. Circling his larger opponent, he parried, blocked, and thrust, but the icy slope was his downfall. Slipping and falling, he was knocked unconscious. Grond raised his club for the killing stroke, but Tarek tackled him. Tumbling apart, they rose to duel. Dow ran and dodged down the slope, with death bolts thudding all around him. Running as swiftly as the snow would allow, he closed the gap. His timing had to be perfect, or his leap could bring him fatally short or over the ox rider. Gauging the distance, he staggered his pace for the greatest leap, but a bolt grazed his face just as he planted his foot for the jump. When he vaulted, he was struck again in the shoulder. Instead of finding the orc's body beneath his grasping arms, the bolt made him fall short, right atop the Goru's very horns. When he was thrown, his body careened against an unmoving tree, and he, unlike the dwarf, did not rise again. Tarek was unable to help, for his opponent blocked his path. He'd seen the orcs use this tactic before. He knew that if Dow wasn't able to rejoin the fight, then the orc on foot would try to hold him at bay while his partner took him down with missile fire. He planned against that tactic with every step. If his enemy's body didn't shield him, then some tree or snow-covered boulder did. The struggle went on for many moments. The trees will protect me, he thought, as he slowly retreated into the thicker woods of the hillside. Grond soon realized that he would have to extricate the self from the thicket, or his comrade wouldn't be able to use his weapon effectively. His frustration grew until he had few choices left. Rushing in, he tried to prevent his quarry's escape. But Tarek wasn't trying to escape. He was merely using his wits to win the fight. Waiting until the orc had wholly committed himself, he counterattacked. Rushing in with whirling blades, he created an impenetrable shield about himself. He was Tarek, son of Enid and Oswin, and the orcs were his sworn enemy. Each time Grond swung, Tarek would rush in and slice his massive forearms. Soon his arms were wet with his own blood, and his grip began to falter. His frustration increased, and so did his murderous intent. Tarek didn't want to risk moving in for the kill too soon. Within the protective embrace of the trees, he held the advantage over his foe, and as he moved among the trees to attack, his opponent was unable to catch him. But fortune is an untrustworthy friend, and luck was not with him this day, for when he struck to kill the orc, the War Master ducked, and his sword embedded itself in the tree of a tall oak. Seeing the elf's misfortune, Gron swung, and not upon Tarek but upon his sword. It had managed to remain unbroken through decades of fighting, but it couldn't withstand the full power of Gron's blow upon its trapped blade, and it snapped near to its hilt. With his veteran sword lost, all Tarek had left to fight with were his wits and his daggers. Unsheathing his second knife from his belt, he backpedaled to gain the safety of distance and brought his weapons up to defend himself. They were the single-edged blades of a ranger, and they were his last resorts. But knives are at a terrible disadvantage against a war club, and when he rushed in, he was struck a mighty blow that sent him tumbling down slope. When he rose, his back flamed with pain. He was punctured. He was alone. He was always alone. To live or die meant no difference to him, but by the gods, orcs still lived, and he meant to see their end. So stand he did. And he took an orc bolt in his right calf for his efforts. Falling to his knees, he fought for the safety of a nearby tree. His mind screamed out in pain. Leaning against the tree, he was certain that no more of the rider's shafts could reach him. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he waited for his enemy. Stomp couldn't reach the wounded elf without dismounting. Gron would just have to finish the job himself. Turning his attention back to the elf that his Goru had crumpled, he intended to make sure that his victim was truly dead. Steadying his mount with his legs, he brought his dreadful death bow to bear. After that shot, Dow Greylynx would never again have gazed upon his wife in life, but Stomp had failed to notice the approach from behind of a small, wounded dwarf. "Oh!" the orcs groaned as two terrific blows hamstrung him. Stomp had no idea what was happening to him as he fell. His shot went harmlessly wide, and he lost his crossbow beneath the body of his falling steed. Rising from the frozen ground, he discovered the cause of his troubles. An enraged dwarf was hacking life and limb from his faithful mount. He had been on Korun-Koth the night that Prince Lorn had died, and it seemed to him in that moment that here again was that same wounded dwarf fighting in a bloody rage. "No, it cannot be," he croaked as he groped for his lost club. Looking into Kur's eyes of madness, he glimpsed the pool of hate and anguish within him, and he knew that it was indeed Argardok. Here was the same blood-covered dwarf who had slain scores of his fellows. Argardok had risen. He'd risen from the dead. If Kur heard any of the orc's words, he didn't show it. Striding with grim purpose over the dead Goru, he continued to hack and chop until Stomp was dead. In his fear, Stomp had never even raised his club to defend himself. Kur had been standing far longer than his wounds should have allowed him to, but his rage had its price, and after that final victory, he collapsed. Pain returned as his fury diminished. He prayed to the Merciless One to rid him of his broken body. His right hand continued to clench Korun-Koth, even after consciousness left him. Kur-Rogoth had raged, but could rage no more this day. Tarek didn't understand what the orc had meant by Hell's Hand, only that the orc's bolts had ceased to thud into the hillside around him. The orc that had sent him rolling was nearly upon him. He had to think fast. The bolt still protruded from his leg. He snapped it off. The pain was numbing, but he could still stand. He thanked the goddess. A ranger with his knives is a deadly foe, and though Gron knew nothing of rangers, he knew that the Lyle Salfar could be tenacious fighters. He was losing blood and growing weak, but there was still plenty of fight left in him. This time he would be more cautious. When they were close enough to see each other eye to eye, they stood for several moments studying each other. Tarek leaned against an oak, his life's blood running into his boot, feet shoulder-width apart. His shirt was torn, pierced and bloody. His hair was matted with sweat despite the cold. "You are finished," Grond said. "Surrender, and I'll let you live." Tarek's eyes stared back at him with an inner fire that was far from extinguished. Grond was nearly as great as the one that had almost killed him in the Witch's Glen, but the orc's left arm was very weak, and he could see that Grond supported the weight of his war club with his right arm alone. His eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "Surrender to me, orc, and I'll kill you quickly." They each understood the other's weaknesses and hated each other for it. It was a psychic duel between warriors. The next moments would decide the victor. Grond lunged, swinging a crushing blow. It was a hit that Tarek had no intention of receiving. Sliding left and under Grond's swing, he struck with his rightmost dagger braced against his forearm, and although it didn't penetrate the orc's steel breastplate, it did sever the leather strap that attached it to his arming point. Grond's armor then slid apart, hanging awkwardly upon him. Tarek stabbed again, but Grond was already in the full swing of his counterattack, and he was taken behind the knees. Falling sideward, he flailed blindly in an attempt to break his fall. By some stroke of luck, his blade slashed the orc's throat, and Grond fell back gurgling. Luckily, when Tarek was struck, he'd been on the move. If his feet had been firmly planted, then his knees would surely have been crushed. Instead of being crippled, he was swept up and thrown down. When he landed, his knees were merely bruised and not broken. Rolling to his feet, he faced Grond. The orc lay sprawled upon the snow, hands grasping at his torn throat. Grond, War Master, would fight no more. Tarek could feel no remorse. Thorn and Crag rode their Goro toward the elf bitch. She stood steadfast upon the slope, with 3 dead orcs at her feet. Her sword's tip was planted in the frozen ground between her feet, and she rested her hands calmly against the pommel. Her silver hair blew freely about her face, and she seemed unconcerned with the death bolts landing at her feet. Kayla watched from his hiding place. The agonizing pain of the orc's poison paralyzed him. He could do nothing to help her. In his impotence, all that he could do was look on in terror. The orcs charged forward in disbelief. Their red-fletched bolts lay all around the bitch, and still she just stood there. But by Orxius, she would not escape their Goru. They churned into the hillside, fearsome jets of steam pouring from their black nostrils. They would gore and trample her. Her scalp would dangle from their lodgepole. Down on the elf wench they rode, laughing with glee as they saw the easy kill before them. "Look, Crag, the elf bitch is too scared to move." Bursting out in nervous laughter, they were certain of an easy victory. Karina wasn't scared, but she was insulted, for she knew the orc's language well, and it wasn't flattering. She was, however, prepared to surprise them, for she was an even better swordswoman than even Dao knew. She preferred a lighter sword, but this human's blade packed a powerful punch that she was beginning to like. She was Lao Salfar, and her people's magic flowed like fire within her. Its power urged her to fight, enhancing her awareness to a keen edge. She was confident in her body's ability to bend to her every whim. Her responsibility went beyond personal victory, for she might well end up being the last one able to tend to the wounded. What good would their conquest bring if all of them simply froze to death before the northern wind? She waited, realizing that the orcs would try to run her down. Her timing had to be perfect. Waiting until the oxen were past the point of turning in their charge, she bolted. She was gone in 2 long strides made quick with battle-driven fear. Crag thought that he'd run right over his victim. That is, until he felt the point of her slashing sword hammering into his chest plate and through his ribs. Reining in his Goru, he would use the beast against her, but his wound weakened him, and the ox was too slow to respond. She was upon him before he could raise his club to smash her. Tearing into them like a silver-maned demoness, she was deadly fast. But her actions took time, and the second rider had recovered enough to charge again and trample her. The deadly bull would have killed any lesser fighter, but Karina was no ordinary warrior. A larger fighter could have tried to pull the orc from his mount in one great leap, but she wasn't even half as massive as her enemy, and such an attempt would have ended in ruin. Yet despite her small size, she and her sword were as one, and she knew how to generate the greatest possible power from her slight frame. So instead of up, she chose down and beside, and her sword caught the charging ox just below its knee. The tremendous impact jarred her hands, nearly tearing her sword from her grasp. The Goru's next step fell upon a right foreleg that could no longer support any weight, and it fell head and shoulders into the hillside. Thorn had no chance of remaining in the saddle, and he plummeted with bone-breaking impact. She wasn't about to let the huge orc rise and meet her head on. In a blur of liquid motion, she stood above Thorn as he rose, lashing out 3 times before his body fell again to the earth. She ended the wounded Goru's pain in a similar fashion. She was Karina Greyling's, and only Kalor had seen how great of a swordswoman she really was. The battle was over. Her friends and foes lay all about the battlefield. There were few sounds save the ever-howling wind. Running out among the fallen, she searched for signs of life, looking for those in greatest need of healing. Kalor had pulled the orc's foul bolt out of himself, but the pain of the act had caused him to black out. His breathing was steady, though, and he seemed out of danger for the moment. Running down slope, she found Carmen pinned beneath the enormous tree trunk, and her face was deathly pale. And that's where we'll end episode 30 on the top of page 321. Next time we'll find out what happens to Carmen and the rest of her rangers. And remember, as always, read Kur's Rage Part 1 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga by me in all of the following novels. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great night.